Damaged Defenders by Sherzad. Chapter 71. Tony! When it finally came time to head for Asgard, the tower emptied. Even Pepper cleared her schedule and came along. Not all of them would stay off Earth for the days, weeks, it'd take for Tony and Cap to talk to all the big kahunas, of course. Pepper only planned to stay 2 days at most out of sheer curiosity. Charles and Hank similarly planned to decamp as soon as their respective parts in the general plan were done. Still, everyone had wanted to go at least the once, and what better time than this? Tony was pretty sure Frigga had been snickering at them and their antics more than once. Charles had too, when he wasn't joining the sci-fi geek-outs. At least folks had been doing something besides getting pissed off about Barnes. Not that that situation didn't deserve getting pissed about, but yeah, dwelling bad. Because all of Tony's time had been consumed with the arm and the necessary arrangements needed for him to leave the planet for as much as a month. The planned debrief on the various realms and their leaders had been postponed until they got to Asgard. Once the arm was built, which would take a day max, Tony would be able to spare the time. They went up in 2 loads. Not because they had to for space on the roof in the arrival room reasons, but, and for damn sure not, the Bifrost can only transport so many reasons. No, it was because of the fact that if there was going to be a time for Barnes to revert to full-on Winter Soldier, having only a flimsy Faraday cage between himself and his targets and or freedom would be the time. Likewise, if the assholes were waiting to make a move, this would be the perfect time to do so. None of the Avengers wanted the civilians anywhere near that sort of potential mess. Granted, Charles could probably freeze anyone in their tracks before stuff got real, but that was only a probably. With their luck, the assholes would have someone on their roster that was immune to telepathy or something. So Frigga had gone ahead with all the non-Avengers, including the new counselor guy Sam, with Agent Natasha, the Cajun, and Merida as their probably unnecessary, but they were all a little bit paranoid bodyguards. Pepper, of course, was in charge of all the stuff Tony had wanted to bring to Asgard in order to make sure he could build the new arm there, as well as the shipping container holding everyone's gear, just in case things worked out well with Hulk. The rest of them, not incidentally all heavy hitters of one stripe or another, stayed to bring Barnes. Tony and Thor had gone to the roof ahead of the rest to fly escort just in case it was needed. The others all headed down to try to load Barnes in the cage and haul him to the roof. When the gang got up there, Tony had to grin. Loki had put one of his force fields around the cage. Smart man. Tony was betting solid money the thing would repel attacks from either side. Barnes was wide-eyed and looking more than slightly anxious, but other than that, he was surprisingly calm. That probably had something to do with the fact that Steve was in the cage with him. Tony touched back down on the roof, seconds behind Thor, who yelled for Heimdall the moment everyone was far enough out on the roof to not cause problems with transport. Barnes folded like a house of cards the second they reached Asgard. Unfortunately, while they'd been able to explain most of what they'd be doing, there was just no explaining how they'd be getting to Asgard, and Barnes, yeah, that hadn't gone over well. He curled up into a tight ball at the bottom of the cage, shaking violently. Cap near plastered himself all over Barnes, muttering reassurances. Not that Tony could hear what was being said, but given the situation, there weren't all that many choices for what he was doing. It took a good 10 or 15 minutes, but Barnes eventually calmed down. Once he did, they let the 2 of them out of the Faraday cage. That seemed to help Barnes in and of itself. He stopped looking terrified out of his mind. Not that he didn't still look scary, just not as badly, and actually started looking around, curiosity playing on his face. It took more restraint than most people believed. Tony had to keep his mouth shut when he realized Barnes and Cap were clinging to each other's hands. The temptation to tease the holy hell out of Steve, at least, was unbelievable. Knowing that Barnes probably desperately needed that anchor kept Tony quiet. He freely admitted he was an asshole, but he wasn't that much of one. Once Barnes was back on his feet, Tony stepped out of his suit and let it close back up. While Jarvis was necessarily limited here in Asgard, thanks to the whole not on Earth thing, there was enough of him in the suit to run the suit, even when Tony wasn't in it. So he'd walk the suit to wherever their gear was going to be stashed until/if they needed it. Pepper handed in the Stark pad that had the plans for Barnes' arm on it. From there, they split up. Thor led Tony to Asgard's smithy, while Loki led the rest of them to the palace. The smithy proved, thankfully, to be a freaking huge, brightly lit room with about 24 men and women scattered around working on various things, as well as what looked like the Asgardian version of teenagers racing back and forth playing Fetch-It Messenger for the folks who were working. As befit a smithy, the place was noisy and hot. Tony was deeply grateful he was used to such decibels thanks to his preference in music. The heat would be a bit more of a problem since he normally worked in much cooler environs, but he'd manage. Thor waved one of the teenagers over.
Pray find Turg and let him know I would have speech with him.
The boy raced off, and about a minute or two later, a guy that would have given Andre the Giant a run for his money ambled over. Tony sort of blinked. Because, hell, Thor was big, height and muscle-wise. This guy topped Thor by about half a foot and near made 2 of him, muscle-wise. The guy was older, white-haired like Odin had been, and unlike pretty much every other Asgardian Tony had met thus far, the guy's body showed burns and scars, all of them very probably from his job.
Prince Thor! Have you come for new armor then? And who is this you bring with you?
Turg peered down at Tony for a moment before something like recognition lit in his eyes.
This is the one they called the Man of Iron then. Rumors have spread of your craft and my skill. Well met!
And the guy extended a hand. Tony fully expected to get his hand crushed when he accepted the handshake. To his surprise, that didn't happen.
Come, Tony,
he said.
With pleasure. Now, Her Majesty the Queen informed me that you would have need of space and possibly material to build something.
Turg asked. Tony almost didn't notice a grinning Thor making himself scarce. Yeah, long story short, I need to build an arm. I got the plans for it. Tony brought the Stark pad out to where Turg could see and showed him the plans. I brought metals from Midgard just in case, but if you guys have something that will work better, I will be all too happy to use it. Turg poked curiously at the pad for a second before studying the plans.
Clever, quite clever. Why the central middle bone?
It's going to be attached to the nervous system of the person getting it. The bone will protect the components that permit that, right up to where they enter the remaining stump of the arm. Tony said, keeping it simple because he didn't know where Asgard was in terms of tech, and even if they were equal to or surpassed Earth in that regard, they might not have the same terms for things, and will serve as an anchor point for any of the stuff that gets installed behind the forearm panel.
Turg nodded. Well, let me show ya. Asgard's metals.
Tony was led to a room at one end of the smithy. The room proved to have neat stacks of metal ingots, each stock taller than he was and about the same size in width. About 3/4 of the different kinds of metals had more than one such stack. Several of them had more than 10 stacks, evidence they were the most used in Asgardian armor and weapons. There was a surprising array of colors, ranging from a silvery white through just about every shade of gray and silver possible, 10 different shades of red, 10 more of red gold, and 4 or 5 of gold. The silver white metal damn near made Loki laugh his ass off. The Asgardians called it something else, but Tony more or less instantly dubbed it Mithril, because that was basically what it was. It was ridiculously light. A 3-inch tall and 8-inch long ingot of the stuff weighed less than a pound, and according to Turg, the stuff could stand up to low and most mid-range energy blasts, and shrugged off anything short of a troll-strength jab with a bladed weapon. It was also one of the metals the Asgardians had the least of, with only one stack of it in the room. Sadly, it was impractical for Barnes' arm. Tony needed to keep the arm close to the weight of Barnes' flesh and blood arm, or he'd have problems. In order to get a mithril arm up to weight, he'd have to weld in plates of other metal, which just wasn't going to work. Still, it'd amuse the hell out of Tony. Tony eventually settled for a metal that was a bit tougher than the alloy in his suits and would make the arm about the right weight. He hauled enough ingots of the stuff out to experiment with. He needed to be sure he'd be able to work the stuff by hand, and Turg showed him to a station he could work at. It took very little time at all for Tony to garner an audience. His nearest neighbors, all working on armor for their fellows to use in the upcoming war apparently, watched him as much as they could while still doing their own work. Those further away found excuses to wander past, as did most of the kids playing runner for the adults. Tony, used to watchful audiences, even if not in this context,
ignored them.
It felt weirdly good to do this by hand. He hadn't since Afghanistan. Though he'd never have admitted it out loud, he'd been a little worried he'd have a flashback or some stupid stuff like that. So he hadn't done more than welding since. It probably helped that this place was about as different from that cave as it was possible to get. A ton more lights, a lot more people, more than a little good-humored chatter back and forth between the closest folks when the noise level allowed. It made a huge difference. Still, Tony didn't strip down to the muscle shirt he'd worn under his usual "I'm fucking around with shit" clothes until he'd soaked his AC/DC t-shirt in sweat. He doubted he'd ever stop being leery of letting the arc reactor be visible. He'd considered a cover panel for it on the suit more than once. But these guys weren't about to hold him down and rip it out of his chest, so he eventually gave in and stripped down so he wouldn't overheat. It took about a half day to get the non-electronic parts of the arm built. At that point, Turv more or less hauled Tony away from the arm by the scruff of his neck. Tony checked the instinct to fight the guy off. Talk about a losing battle. He wasn't sure he'd be able to fight the guy off in the suit, much less out of it. Didn't stop him from giving the guy his most lethal glare for whatever it was worth. Not much.
Your work ethic is to be admired, man of iron, but even the hardiest souls need sustenance after a long day of crafting.
Tony snorted but gave in and followed Turv to the eating hall. The rest of the gang were there, even Barnes. He had Steve on one side of him and the tiniest, oldest Asgardian Tony had yet seen sitting on his other side. It was a woman, white-haired and wrinkled in a way even Odin hadn't been, and Natasha's side. Natasha being 5 feet and 3 inches of instant sudden death, rather than the height of Sif or the Queen, both of whom were taller than Tony. Turv split off to go hang out with his friends, and Tony plunked himself down next to Pepper, who'd saved a seat for him.
Who's the lady by Barnes?
He wanted to know. Lady Ira, Asgard's head healer, and apparently second only to Frigga in skill in that department, Pepper told him. She is apparently from the tough love school of healing and felt that Barnes needed to be with everyone else, even here, rather than tucking him somewhere less full of people and things to potentially trigger him. She came along to provide help if he freaked out or something.
Tony smirked. He could like a doctor like that, especially since she would have had to argue Steve around her point of view, a not inconsiderable feat. He was famously intolerant of being coddled himself and regularly gave his doctors and Pepper gray hair by ditching as much of the molly-coddling as he could humanly manage. Sometimes, admittedly, he ducked more than he should, and sooner, but still.
I should have the arm finished by a decent hour to go to sleep tonight, Tony said. So they'll be able to switch the arms out tomorrow. And while they're doing that, the rest of us can sit on Cap, because he's going to be fretting. We can try working with Hulk while Barnes is recovering from the surgery.